And welcome back to the Walter Bosley channel. Here with our friend Todd Wood and our guest, Professor Horan. And we're now going to, for a little bit, discuss something really interesting that Professor Horan, you brought up last time we were talking, something I had no idea. It came up in reference, I believe, to the East India Company, correct?
Well, that's one example. That's like a branch or a franchise of the company,
Yeah, I
like
think that's how it came up. We were talking
yeah.
about that kind of idea, and you kind of laid on me something I didn't know, and that's what we're going to explore right now. So,
Okay.
welcome, Professor, and tell us about the company.
Well, a lot of people, when you hear the word the company and conspiracy groups, we think of the CIA. And what I tell people is the CIA is not the company, but they are the company intelligence agency. They don't work for America. They don't work for you. They work at the upper levels. They work for the company. What is the company? There was I can't remember his name and I don't have the slide prepared. He wrote a book that you need to read. It was published in 1957, 1959, and it's called The Power Elite. And this is not a right wing conspiracy theory. He was a very super lefty sociology professor. And he talked about, and you read the book, and what he's talking about is the company. The Bushes belong to the company, the Rothschilds belong to the company. The company is kind of like a mafia. They're kind of like a religion. They're kind of in the Christian church. When they were the Christian church, they called themselves the ecclesia. So they kind of take on different identities, and different factions within the company gain control over the others. And how far back does this go? What does they do? What do they do basically? Basically, what the company does is, and I need to, where's my little tool I need here? That's not it. Why did I need my little clicker thing. Where is that? Try this again. What's this? Slideshow from current slide. I should have my little thing. Don't need that. Oh, crap. Maybe if I
No
use,
worries. We can,
you know what? I just use a keyboard. How's that?
yeah.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
fine.
forget that. Okay.
There
What
we
the
go.
company does is, I don't even know. Can your fans even see this?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good. What the company does is operate the global economy. They don't own the whole thing, but they operate it. And they don't operate the entire economy, but the company operates the global economy. And how long have they been? And I'm going to zip through this. I'm going to summarize and oversummarize and overgeneralize this. This is the so-called Fertile Crescent. This is the Mediterranean. This is Turkey, Anatolia. This is the Levant. Okay, this is where Palestine is. This is where Syria is. The Fertile Crescent. And then it kind of meets here at Aleppo. There's this plateau and a pass, a plain here where Aleppo is, and the rivers to the west of that flow west to the Mediterranean. The rivers to the east of Aleppo flow east down to the Gulf. And the Euphrates and Tigris are the two biggest and most famous rivers in this system. So beginning by about 8,000 BC, you have fortified towns like Aleppo and Jericho, which dominate trade routes because the human population is growing to the point where there's trade. So we find evidence of trade all the way from about Gaza, all the way around the Fertile Crescent, all the way coming out here to the Persian Gulf, going back as far as 8,000 BC, and a few fortified towns where you have these local warlords who extract tariffs, taxes from this trade. And we think for a long time this is merchants handing stuff along all the way back and forth. They're passing things along, going both ways. This goes back to about 8,000 BC. Jason and Medea, the story of Jason and the Argonauts, is set approximately 1300 BC. So this goes on for a long time without there being any. There's not that big of a population and the economy is not very big, but there's already trade taking place. So that by like 6500 BC, Chateaubriand and Göbekli Tepe and places like this where you're making this transition to settled farming and the economy begins to grow a little bit and you have some stuff to trade. So the next big step, well, I'm kind of zooming in here. So you have the Jordan River Valley as a trade route that goes all the way down to the um, past the Dead Sea and all the way down here to the Red Sea. And that plugs you into the trade routes that go along the coast of Saudi Arabia. And then you have the Tigris, and especially the Euphrates River is another highway, goes all the way up into southeastern, like into Georgia. Is that Kazakhstan up there? And here in the middle is Aleppo. Aleppo was like the first Alexandria. Aleppo was like the crossroads of the world at this time, even before the Sumerian Empire arises. And then down here you have the savannah is drying up in Egypt, and they're being crowded along the Nile River Valley, and they're forced to organize civilization along the Nile River Valley as well. Here's Jericho, maybe 10,000 years old. Aleppo, 10, 11,000 years old. Göbekli Tepe, 10 to 12,000 years old. But it's not a city. It's not a settlement. It's a monument complex. So you have trade beginning here, and you're starting to have these city-states, which are basically, they're more like concentration camps. They're more like massive slave plantations is basically what they are. But the economy is beginning to grow because the population is beginning to grow. So by around 2350 BC to 2300 BC, you have kings like Sargon, of the city of Akkad, who conquers most of the other city-states and even starts making incursions into Lebanon, which is primarily a big cedar forest at the time, and creates this first empire. So you have one entity which is controlling this trade route and cleaning up the piracy, cleaning up, everybody got his hand in the, so that you kind of get some trade actually flowing all along here by 2300. And it's not very long after this that the Egyptians are starting to build pyramids. But the Akkadian Empire, Sargon's empire, is really just going along and taking control of and founding new plantation cities. There's not a lot of economy beyond surplus grain. That's about it. But the thing about the Sumerians is, and the Akkadians is, they're deeply hated and resented by the people they conquer. But one thing that's very important is they teach everybody, including the Hittites, how to use cuneiform to start keeping records. And this is the dawn of the historical age. Prehistory is before writing. So they kind of kick off the writing revolution and keeping track of, they have chronicles and they have records of what they're doing. They invent money. These local tax collectors have these clay tablets with 50 bushels of corn and 17 bales of wool or whatever, and they trade these back and forth. This is money, instead of having to trade the goods. So you kind of get the first inklings of this is going to be the root of the global economy. It's going to spread west from here, and it's going to spread east from here. And it's about this time that the Minoans establish, and who might have been Egyptian people, they establish this trade route, the circle of winds and currents in the eastern half of the Mediterranean. This is the rise of the Minoans. And this is when the Egyptians first begin to build pyramids, is right at this time. And right in the middle of this is Jericho, which doesn't control the coast, but it does control the Jordan River Valley. And eventually you're going to have, so you have the valley, it's a pretty broad valley. So down here, right next to the river is Jericho. Then you go up the slope to Jerusalem on the west bank a few miles, and you go up a few miles to the northeast of the Jordan River. That's the ancient city of Amman. And
spent a lot of time there.
yeah, there you go. Well, that's a very important city. So anybody who controls both Jerusalem and Amman can control the entire Jordan River Valley trade route, but it goes through the desert. It's not much of a trade route yet, and there's not much spice trade in the Red Sea yet. So this is where we are at that time, and then the next big stage is, because of widespread resentment, a weird thing happens to the Akkadian Empire. They start planting new cities in the northern central part of their empire, And the best guess anybody has is a comet broke up as it approached the Earth, and at least four major pieces of the comet impacted the atmosphere in Tunguska-like events, all along, I think it's the Tigris River Valley,
Mhm.
the northern part of this Akkadian Empire. You get these, there are, in one city in particular, I don't remember the name of the city, the archaeology shows a massive shockwave, like a volcanic explosion, but there's no volcanic ash. It shows an intense lightning storm, and even the little chemical lumps of people being hit by lightning and being vaporized. Like an incredible disaster hit this city, an incredibly intense fireball. So the only known explanation would be volcano, but there's no volcanic ash. The only other, and this hits four other places along this northern part here where the Hurrians are, up in this area here. And there's this one city in particular, this new city. Well, it was an old city that the Acadians took over. They're in the middle of revitalizing the city. They're expanding the city. And everybody like flees the city one day and they don't go back to get their stuff. And this happens around 2100 BC. And apparently it was destroyed by a comet. And you get these legends that the Sumerians were judged by the gods as being, you know what, and this natural disaster really happened. So their empire collapses around 2100 BC. Eventually, the Egyptians are going to move all the way up the east coast of the Mediterranean, all the way up to Cilicia, which is the southeast part of Turkey.
Uh-huh.
And they are going to and the Minoans have had their own natural disaster, the explosion of the volcano Akrotiri. So they're down. So the Egyptians come out here and take over. And they apparently have a lot more to do with taking over the sea routes as well, because later on, like the days of the Trojan War, names like Agamemnon and Menelaus, those are Egyptian names, not Greek names.
Okay.
So
Hmm.
people kind of forget the Egyptians actually ruled this part at one time. So it's not so much, and they did probably take slaves back to Egypt, but the Hebrews there's no evidence the Hebrews were ever kept as slaves in Egypt. But there are Hyksos people who dominate northern Egypt or lower Egypt about this time. History's not real clear on this, but this is, so by 1000 BC, the Assyrian Empire arises here, takes over from the ashes of the Akkadian Empire, and then forces their way down the coast and actually conquers Lower Egypt. This is about 1000 BC. And they now control these coastal cities, and this becomes more of the Phoenician maritime empire, right approximately 1000 BC. And Lord Baal, the king of Tyros, becomes a vassal of Sennacherib in 700 BC, and now you have this global economy. You have the Phoenicians establish this Mediterranean trading empire that goes all the way up to Britain. They go out west past the Pillars of Hercules. They go all the way around the coast of Spain. This is when my ancestors moved to Spain and Portugal, and they make their way up to Britain, and I'll get to that in a second. So now you have one unified, and by this time the population and economy has grown so that you have a spice road that goes all the way around the Arabian Peninsula. It goes down through the Persian Gulf, comes back around the Red Sea, and all these spices are being traded. They're not being traded to flavor food. Spices are being traded because of their medicinal, their pharmacological properties. So the drug trade has started. And you also have a road on the way to India. And the other funny thing is, there's a funny coincidence. Around 1450 BC is when we think the first parts of the Veda, the sacred scriptures, astronomical scriptures of the Hindu religion, are written. They start to be written down right about the time the Egyptians take over the western half of the Akkadian Empire. Like there's some kind of connection that happened there. That's probably what happened. So now you have one big empire maintaining law and order when the population has grown and the economy has grown and trade is growing. But it doesn't quite go all the way to China. China is still isolated at this time. So the Neo-Assyrian Empire, this is the time of King Hezekiah, this is close to 600 BC. They are very modern and ruthless, and instead of just telling you, you owe us 10,000 pounds of silver a year, they leave overseers to manage your city state the way they want it run. These are, and the Greek word for this is episkopos, a bishop, an overseer. This is also deeply resented. But one thing they do that's very smart is they take people and they move them around their empire to try to homogenize their empire. They've taken over this Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And one big revolution happens. All written records from this time forward are no longer written in cuneiform. They're now written in a new, modern, efficient Canaanite alphabet called Aramaic, which becomes Hebrew, becomes Greek,
Right.
becomes Arabic, becomes every alphabet in the world is based on this alphabet. It's replaced all the way across the Assyrian Empire, all the way across what is very close to now being a global economy. North and South America, there's not much there, but you've got everything but North and South America in a global economy. And particularly these people, these 10 lost tribes of so-called Israel, which never existed. But these people are fluent in this new alphabet. They are fluent in economics. They are fluent in finance. They are fluent in trade. They have their own little religion that they can take with them. Most religions at this time, their God is tied to a geographical location, but these people have a God they take with them in the form of a book. So they get this special privilege. They live in their own communities. There are Jews living in Iraq even to this day from this so-called Babylonian captivity. Although I think ISIS tried to wipe them out. They've been living there since probably before then. And we know this is also a cultural change because Aramaic suddenly becomes at least the alphabet that's used all across what was then the known civilized world. So this is not just the birth of people, the Jews. When we talk about the Jews today, we're talking about one branch of the Jews, the so-called maybe Ashkenazi Jews, right? When we think of Orthodox Jews, when we think of the Torah and we think of the dietary laws, that's just one branch. They stay behind in Judah and Samaria, but the rest of them are dispersed and never come back. They stay there. They start operating this new pan-world economy. And that's where the stereotype comes from, that the Jews run the economy. They don't own it, but they operate it. They know how to operate this trading economy, if you can maintain law and order in particular. And people actually start to travel. Instead of just passing goods along like a fireman in the bucket brigade, you have merchants and caravans traveling from one end of the world to another. And by 1200, all the way back in 1200 BC, did I skip over that one? 1200 BC, shipwreck found at Haifa on the coast of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Ingots of tin from Cornwall, mined and processed on an industrial scale, shipped to Israel to be worked by Philistine artisans.
Wow.
1200 BC. So I'm talking about an economy that runs from Ireland almost to China. Well, this is so I'm summarizing this really quickly. Right around this time, an Indo-European tribe invade the Neo-Assyrian Empire called the Medes, who take over briefly. But it's really under the Medes that Aramaic replaces cuneiform permanently across this empire, and cuneiform just dies out. Early Persian records are in cuneiform. After this, they're in Aramaic. So it's a common language. And like this story of Daniel and which king? Daniel makes this guy king. These are people without power, but they have influence. So these Jews living in Babylon, it's not Nebuchadnezzar. Which king was it that He was king because Daniel said he was king. And then later on, when Daniel says he's not king anymore, he's not king anymore. And you get all these lessons from these stories. One of them is there's this ghostly hand, there's this writing that appears on the wall of this banquet that the king is throwing. And the king says, Daniel, what does that writing say? And Daniel says, it says you're not king anymore. And part of the lesson of this, and I think part of the history is, the king was raised to read cuneiform. He can't read Aramaic, and Daniel reads Aramaic. But this class of people, these merchants and bankers and lawyers and translators and diplomats, have achieved the kind of power where Daniel has become a king. He can't make himself king, but he is a kingmaker. And we have a parallel story about Joseph being an official in Egypt at the same time. These people are achieving this influence, the Jews, in a more broad term, because they're operating this economy. So the next big step, Aramaic on the right replaces cuneiform. So we know it's a people with a common culture because people don't learn something that fast. All these 10 lost tribes were dispersed all the way across this empire. So here's some pictures of some Jews who were living in Iraq, going all the way back to the Babylonian captivity, the so-called captivity. King Solomon supposedly, here they are, the ingots, 1200 BC. These are ingots found at Haifa, Israel. And then you have, and remember, it's the Phoenician architect, Hiram Abiff from Tyre,
Yeah.
who builds Solomon's temple. He's a Phoenician, not an Egyptian. He's
Right.
Phoenician. But he may have been Egyptian because the Egyptians, of course, had a strong presence there for a long time. So Judaism in the Bible, you get Egyptian religion, you get Persian religion, you get Hittite religion, you get Canaanite religion. So that's what's going on there. Now, Moloch was not a god. Moloch is the word for sacrifice. Samuel anoints David. David is this mercenary, and David has his capital at Samaria, which is north of Jerusalem, north of Judea, and he captures the city of Ammon, according to legend. So now you have one ruler over both Jerusalem and Ammon, and guess what that does? That opens up the Jordan River Road to trade. David's coat of arms is identical to the coat of arms of Ireland.
I was looking at that and thinking, that looks familiar.
So then in the 650s, King Croesus of Lydia, which is most of Turkey, he invents coinage where he takes valuable metals in standard units and then he stamps them with his trademark so people know that it's the right purity and the right weight. He invents coins. He invents currency. He doesn't invent money. The Sumerians invented paper money before they invented coins. So he invents coins. So now everybody's fighting over this part of the world here. So the next thing, the Sennacherib conquers Hezekiah's kingdom. There we go. So here we go. The Persian Empire indoctrinate these Jewish captives, their priestly class. They tell them, oh, your ancestors were tricked into worshiping a false god. The good news is we've got copies of your old original books and we know your old original religion. You used to worship the one true God, Ahura Mazda. Let us fix your religion so when you go back, you can do things the right way from now on. This is how they indoctrinate. So the Jews and one of the big Zoroastrian ideas is prophecy, the charismatic prophet, right? Who speaks directly with the voice of God. So one of the interesting things is this is a coin from the 4th century BC. It's a Sumerian, so this would be the kingdom of David, north of Judah, so-called Israel, which never actually existed. But this is a god with wings and a wheel, which looks an awful lot like Ahura Mazda. And the inscription on this so-called Jewish coin, it might say Yahweh and it might say Yehud. There's an argument over what these letters actually represent. And I'm just, for future reference, remember this symbol, the Neo-Assyrian, the Nazis adopted that particular eagle, and so did a lot of South American dictatorships. They see themselves as heirs to this Persian Empire. So, what's this got to do with the company? So Alexander the Great comes along. It's like a coup d'etat. It's not really a conquest, it's a coup d'etat. So he really brings Europe into the global economy. The rest of Mediterranean Europe is now brought into the global economy by Alexander, and he very briefly the almost opens up the Silk Road. It almost goes all the way to China. He almost pulls this off, but stabilizes the Spice Road and stabilizes after the Romans. And after this is the Romans are going to take over the Western Mediterranean from the Phoenicians. What you need to know about this is now you've got at least 2/3 of the global and a common culture and this tradition of syncretizing religions and syncretizing cultures into one world culture. The whole idea of a unified world, the whole idea of a one world peaceful kingdom begins with Alexander. The next big step is Alexander's empire falls apart, and it falls apart along the old classic lines. It falls the Hittites in the northwest. Well, the Persians kind of keep most of Turkey for a long time. You got the Egyptians in the southwest, and you have the Persians to the northeast, basically. And once again, for a while, the Ptolemies in Egypt, they control both Jerusalem and Amman. They give Amman to the family called Tobias, but their wars. But now that between the Seleucids, which take the old Persian Empire place, and especially in Syria and places like this that border on the Egyptian, the border here is just southwest of Jerusalem, just southwest of Gaza, is kind of the border between the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire, which start butting heads. The Ptolemaic Empire is more Greek and Egyptian, and the Seleucid Empire is more Persian influenced. And you have Jews living on both sides of this Iron Curtain. So their cultures kind of diverge a little bit, but they're the ones who run the global economy. So there's still contact, and it's still family groups, and it's still a common culture. But there's a point where this link gets broken, and the Jordan River Road now becomes a wild place where you don't have. So the Romans start getting big-headed, and they start playing. They can't make a deal with number 1 and number 2, so they make a deal with number 3. They make a deal with this funny little group of people in Judea around Jerusalem that we will end up calling the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans. And they instigate a revolt against the Egyptian Ptolemies. And they back this revolt. Now, at this point, without Amman, Jerusalem, which was called Philadelphia in those days, Jerusalem is worthless. It costs more money than it's worth. What are the Romans up to? But they backed this revolt. And one thing this revolt does it like an ethnic and cultural cleansing of all of Judea. They drive out all foreign influences. These are religious fanatics. The Romans may have bitten off more than they could chew. We'll never really know. But the Ptolemies, the Tobias family, still control Amman at this time. The Romans don't have control of this. 125 BC, the Silk Road has made contact with Western China. So in response, the Han Dynasty, and maybe with support from the West, we'll never really know, they managed to expand and conquer and stabilize Western China. Now you have the Silk Road runs all the way deep into China, runs all the way. You can literally travel from Beijing or whatever all the way to Ireland. It's a global economy, and not just trade is flowing, but now you have bankers who have become important. And you have lawyers. There's a kind of like one common law that runs along these roads, and you have China, you have the Kushite Empire where Afghanistan is now, and then you have the Seleucid Empire. So silk is first imported to Rome in around 25 or 30 AD. blowing is spreading. Spread of Buddhism into Central Asia. The Kushan Empire controls much of Central Asia. Greco-Egyptian geographer Claudius Ptolemy writes his geography and attempts to map the Silk Road. They're aware they have a global economy, and it booms because the population in the world economy is now there's enough stuff to trade. The economy begins to boom, and so where the Phoenician Empire ran along the west coast of Europe up to the British Isles, that's kind of they're cut off from the rest of the Mediterranean by the Romans. They kind of dribble along as best they can and become the Viking Empire, which will eventually come down the Don River, Dnieper River, Volga River, all the way down into Ukraine. And the Vikings, among other things, are not only great mariners, but they also are known to have sacrificed their children, just like the Phoenicians. I think the Phoenician Empire in the West gradually becomes the Viking Empire, more or less, and the Visigothic kingdoms. And then this red line, this is the Romans doing it overland at about this time. So you have this merchant class in Rome who are not part of the patrician class, and they have friends in the company. They have friends in this quasi-Jewish merchant trading network. And they pick a down on his heels scion of this old patrician family, Julius Caesar, and they back him. And he starts this war of conquest going across Gaul. What for? Well, they figured out that the Britons have their own source of gold, copper, and silver, and they want to get their hands on that. So they don't do it by the sea routes. They do it overland. So you kind of have the Viking Phoenician Empire on the Atlantic Ocean and the North Sea, and you have the Romans doing their thing overland across Gaul. Does that make sense? But now you have a truly global empire. You have a southern route, you have a northern route, and it goes from Ireland all the way to the east coast of China. And then the Chinese start expanding into the Western Pacific with their empire. So you have a global economy. And there's the Silk Road and there's the Spice Road. You have the two roads, the Silk Road and the Spice Road. So, and it's being run by pretty much people trained and growing up in a culture, and your badge of membership is you got to get circumcised. That's the mark of Cain. Circumcision is the mark of Cain. You got to get circumcised to join this club. They got to know that you're serious. If you want to, you can join the club. You can join the company. So at this point, you have not necessarily an official company, but you have a network of merchants and bankers and lawyers who are related by blood and by culture, and they become known as the Jews, but not, it's a somewhat more general term than the Jews that we would think of today, Ashkenazi Jews. And my family are some of these Sephardic Jews who were living in Spain and Portugal at this time. So in 85 BC, the Romans make a peace deal with the Nabateans, and Aretas III, who has conquered Syria, most of Syria, the Romans make a deal with him, and they start cutting out their own clients, the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans. They start dealing behind their backs because the Romans want to open up that trading route to the Spice Road, because they're not yet powerful enough to challenge the Seleucids, the Persians, for control of the Silk Road. They're not that powerful yet. But if they can bypass the Ptolemies in Egypt and go down the Jordan River Valley to the Red Sea, they would be plugged in at least to the Spice Road, which is becoming extremely lucrative because spices are light in weight and they're very valuable because of their pharmacological properties. So you get this situation where the Romans are kind of double dealing, and they make a deal with Herod Antipater marries a Nabatean woman. And so now he has control of Ammon, and he has control of Petra. So when Rome makes a deal where they make Antipater, Herod Antipater, the father of Herod the Great, they make him king, or basileus, quasi-king over Jerusalem and Judah, now they think we've got it plugged together. We've got Jerusalem and Ammon plugged together. Now we've got the global economy. We've got our own pipeline into the global economy. This is what they think. So the old school Hasmoneans revolt. They get backing from the Parthian Empire, which has replaced the Seleucid Empire. They've replaced the Persians, the Zoroastrian, the Eastern mystical culture, but they're still Jews, and they're influenced by this culture, naturally. So Antigonus II Mattathias leads a revolt against Rome, backed by the Parthians, which makes him a traitor to Rome. So he is captured and handed over by his own people, and he is tried and sentenced to crucifixion by Rome, by Mark Antony in 37 BC. The Romans now have firm control, at least militarily, over both Jerusalem and Amman, and now they control the Jordan River Road is now open to trade down to the Spice Road. They can bypass the Ptolemies and they can bypass the Parthians, and the Romans use this as a wedge to start wedging the Parthians out of Syria, out of Turkey, and the Romans eventually conquered that way over the next couple of hundred years. And have they got? But the Romans don't. They collect taxes at the top. They're a big protection racket. They let the company continue to run the global economy. And it's this people with a common culture, and it's a club, and outsiders can join, but the enrollment requirements are pretty strict. So what happens next? The Romans suffer a defeat at Carrhae, sets them back, so they really have to depend on the Spice Road to keep their riches flowing. So eventually, it's more of the Torah, the non-Orthodox Jews become Christians. The first Christians are basically Zoroastrian Jews. They become like the first Christians, and then Westerners, Neoplatonists, they don't like what we would call Gnostic influences in the ecclesia. But ecclesia means ruling class. It's a Greek word from Greek democracy. And they are the people who are eligible to vote and who are eligible and required to hold public office. And so that's called the ecclesia. So this new underground group, which is also, it's a new form of Judaism that you can join without being circumcised. And it also, they become like a shadow government because these law courts that operate the global economy, their religion matters, their religious upbringing, their religious laws matter. That's how they decide cases. So this ecclesia become a shadow government. And they're attempting to build their vision of the kingdom of God on earth, and they eventually do. They eventually become the ruling party of the late Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. They're the ruling party. They are the ecclesia. They are also the company. The company takes over the Roman Empire as administrators. They call themselves the ecclesia. They're the first corporation. It's not quite like a modern corporation. When you join the ecclesia, you give everything, you donate everything to the ecclesia, and then the ecclesia takes care of you for life. And then when you die, the ecclesia keeps what you donated to the ecclesia. So it's like a corporation, but you don't have shares, and you can't trade your shares, and you can't pull your shares out. Although there's a famous case where that did happen. So the Silk Road has meant the smuggling of mulberry seeds and silkworm eggs westward, and they make their way. The Han Dynasty collapses, succeeded by the Three Kingdoms. China's no longer unified. The Sasanians come to power, and the Eastern Europeans are growing their own mulberries, and they're producing their own silk to a great extent. So you have the comings and goings of the company. You have the comings and goings, the ups and downs of the company, and different factions are going to vie for control of the company. What does the company do? It operates the global economy. It doesn't own it. It's not a strictly organized hierarchy, but it is a loose blob of people who are connected through culture and blood who operate the global economy for everybody's benefit. Mm-hmm. Emperor Theodosius makes Nicene Christianity the empire state religion. So in the West, they're trying to push out these Gnostic influences from the East. So the Europeans and the Byzantines developed their own silk industry. Now we're going to come around to Napoleon Bonaparte here in just a minute, I promise. So the Visigoths conquer Western Europe from the Roman Empire, and they even take away North Africa. So the Eastern Roman Empire recovers from this in Justinian's Reconquista, where he takes most of Europe back from the Visigoths and take most of North Africa back from the Visigoths, relies very heavily on large numbers of Arab mercenaries. And these Arab mercenaries are apparently Nestorian Christians. Nestorian Christians don't believe in the Trinity. They're non-Trinitarian. They are the direct ancestors of the Unitarian religion, which you'll notice if you know anything about Freemasonry is basically Unitarianism. There are three doors into the temple: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Islam itself is basically Nestorian Christianity, except Jesus doesn't die on the cross. His shadow dies on the cross instead. Otherwise, Islam is basically Nestorian Christianity. And these people spread across Europe. A lot of them go back home after the Reconquista. Some stay behind, especially in North Africa. Later on, more Orthodox Islam that we're used to thinking of, once again, like Orthodox Judaism, that spreads westward and kind of creates a Taliban-like. But at the beginning, this Reconquista from the Visigoths and the Germans takes place with the help of huge numbers of Arab Nestorian Christian mercenaries. So, and in fact, a Christian Bahira, a Christian monk named Nestura, is the one who sees Muhammad and says he's the next prophet. He's the next and last prophet. So we're pretty sure he was a Nestorian Christian. And one thing that this is, so the Spice Road in particular now becomes dominated by the so-called Muslims. But Nestorian merchants are known to be in China as early as the Tang Dynasty, which is around... And this is at a time when this is the church militant. This is Jesus Christ portrayed as the king of the world. He doesn't carry a sword, but his crucifix is sometimes a spear. He sometimes carries a spear. He's wearing the red cloak, the scarlet cloak of the Caesars, and he is conquering eastwards. And he's bringing apocalypse with him. He's wiping out paganism, bringing apocalypse with him. And like when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, I am the via, the veritas, and the vita, that sounds like Caesar's campaign speech, Winnie Witty Wiki. And he is, in early depictions of Christ, he is a soldier or a general wearing the cloak of the Caesars and carrying the spear, sometimes is in the form of a crucifix. Well, as the Middle Ages drag on, so what happens next is the Muslim Arabs control the southern half of the global economy, and that includes the Spice Road. The Christians, the Nicene Christians, they control the northern half of the global empire, and that includes the Silk Road. And as the early Middle Ages go on, the Drapers Guild becomes the Drapers Guild. Instead of being the church, the company in the north is the Drapers Guild. In the south, it's going to become basically the Templars. The Arabs and some Western European Christians are going to form I'm oversimplifying by calling them the Templars, but the Templars they are operating the global economy, and they're specifically known as bankers and merchants, things like this. But they work very closely with the Arab world, the Muslim world, whereas the Drapers Guild is the company in the north, and they become the wealthiest class in the late medieval Roman Empire, especially in the north and in Northern Europe. The Drapers Guild. They control the Silk Road, they control the textile industry. This is all that British, it's no longer so much about the British gold mines and tin mines. Now it's about British wool and flax and being part of this global textile-driven economy. So this is the conquest of Jerusalem by Arabs. It was more the shock of the Arab Christians. That was okay. These are more fundamentalist Muslims, Shia Muslims, I think maybe. I kind of get the two confused. I don't want to offend anybody. But now all of a sudden the only legal contact with the global economy is through Constantinople for Christians. Christians are forbidden by law to do business with Muslims. That's why the Templars get this little secret edge. But in the meantime, the Drapers Guild, the Drapers Guild, I don't have to go into every little detail. So you have all these Jews, Sephardic Jews who flee Jerusalem after the Muslim takeover, and they go up into the Pannonian Plain. This is Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Albania, where the Huns lived, Hungaria, okay? This is where all these Sephardic Jews settle. These are the people who are going to invent communism, and these are the people who are going to invent the Unitarian Church. These are Sephardic Jews who were already practically Nestorian Christians and Muslims to begin with, and they settle, and the center of all this is Bratislava at this time. This is Bratislava. So you now have two contact roads, the Middle East, one coming out of Constantinople that runs through Bratislava into Northern Europe, but you also have this secret organization of merchants who are still doing business with the Muslim world coming up through Venice and coming up through Genoa. I think this is Genoa on the west. That's Genoa. So you get for secret books and all this knowledge comes up through Constantinople, up through the Pannonian Plain. These people become the Rosicrucians and related organizations like the Oculus, the Rosicrucians, and coming up out of Egypt and the Levant, you have these contacts. They become first the Knights Templar, and then they become eventually the Freemasons. So you have the company kind of divided into two. It's kind of like there's been a breakup of the company. So the Drapers Guild in particular, what are they doing in Corsica? Well, the Phoenicians become the Etruscans. Some of them become Etruscans, or the Phoenicians, Etruscans, and they have a presence on the island of Corsica, which doesn't have much of an economy, but it's a good trading depot west of Italy on your way to France. So going back to the Phoenicians, they have trading posts and law courts on the island of Corsica. Well, during the Crusades, the Knights Templar emerge as rivals to the Drapers Guild in terms of finance and all this other stuff. Well, Christendom loses the Crusades, and therefore they lose direct contact once again to the spice roads. So this is by around 1300 AD. And Corsica is eventually absorbed by the Republic of Genoa around the year 1050 or so. The Communal Company of Genoa. In the year 958, a diploma granted by Berengar of Italy gave full legal freedom to the city of Genoa, guaranteeing the possession of its lands. The new city-state was termed a communal company. The local organization remained politically and socially significant for centuries. So the members of the Grand Council were classified both by the company to which they belonged, there were several companies, as well as by their political faction. So the Corsicans plant mulberry trees and cultivate silkworms and harvest silk on behalf of the Genoese company. Silk manufacturing centers were established in Venice, Florence, Genoa, and Lucca, but also the Genovese colony of Caffa on the Black Sea, blah, 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 blah. Trees are still there. There was an attempt to revitalize the silk industry in the early days of French rule. Napoleon's father was one of the initiators. The Drapers Guild becomes so wealthy, they start founding the first European banks. Before the Knights Templar, the families in the Drapers Guild were forming the first banks in Europe.
Are you familiar with Joseph Farrell's works, specifically Babylon's Banksters and the Financial Vipers of Venice?
Is that the one where he talks about they tried to take over England during the time of the Tudors? It's like a coup.
Well, they do. You know how the bank moves from Venice to Amsterdam to London eventually.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you have Genoa, which is a fierce, and Florence. These are fierce competition among these city-states. Fierce competition going on.
Oh, yeah.
So, like the Drapers Guild are the major financiers of financiers of the rebuilding of the Chartres Cathedral, for example.
Okay.
So, the banking houses of Medici and Barenberg were Drapers Guild from the Middle Ages. The biggest banks and oldest banks are formed by the Drapers Guild. Now, the House of Denari are apparently more spice road traders, and they arrive in Sicily around 960 AD. But um, Medici, Bardi, Rothschild, these are Drapers Guild families who accumulate so much money they start the first banks. They foreclosed on whole kingdoms from time to time.
Hmm.
Um, so they start as cloth merchants. Anthony Philips van Leeuwenhoek was a Dutch microbiologist, a microscopist, a largely self-taught man in science, blah, 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 blah. He was a member of the Drapers Guild.
Hmm.
Harry S. Truman, he was a haberdasher. Edward Whalley, regicide, cousin of Oliver Cromwell. He was a mercer. He was involved in the wool and textile trade.
Hmm.
George Williams, founder of the YMCA. John Woodward, geologist and physician to King Charles II. They're all members of the Drapers Guild. Well, in England, an informal association of drapers had organized as early as 1180, and the first Lord, see, they had to stay underground. You were
Sure.
not allowed to keep any secrets from the king, except a guild was allowed to keep their trade secrets, so secret societies. So, 1361 received a royal charter, incorporated as a company under a royal charter in 1438, was the first corporate body to be granted a coat of arms. The Drapers Guild, the Drapers Company, is the first company to be granted a coat of arms, like they were noblemen.
Okay.
That's the Drapers Guild in England. They have several guilds, but it's all the Drapers Guild.
Sure.
Um, one of the most powerful companies in London's civic politics. Three had not been expected to become a monarch at the time of their admission to the company, but were later crowned. Prince William of Orange, member of the company. Prince Karl of Denmark, member of the company. Prince Albert, Duke of York, later George VI, King of England, member of the Drapers Company.
What?
Prince Frederick. Yeah, it's when I call it the company, it's the company.
Yeah.
So this is in England. What's this got to do with America? There's a famous painting by Rembrandt, the syndics of the Drapers Guild. They set wages and prices, and they grade the quality of all the textiles and all the wool. So this is the company, a short history of a revolutionary idea. Is a good book. The Company in Corsica. The Company in Corsica, okay, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to try to speed up a little bit here. Genoese Bank of St. George repossesses the entire island of Corsica. Bank of St. George, financial institution of the Republic of Genoa. The whole Republic of Genoa was a bank. And they war with Venice. The bank's primary mission was to facilitate management of the San Giorgio shares. It was one of the oldest chartered banks in Europe. So the Genoese company takes possession of Corsica. The Bank of St. George was built in the 13th century, housed the prisons in which Marco Polo was held. Then he
This
gets out of prison and writes this book.
this bank I talk about in my Napoleon book, because he might have had a relative who married into that family, who was
Well,
in the days of Columbus, an associate of
well,
Columbus.
well, it's funny you should mention because Pasquale de Paoli establishes a Masonic Republic of Corsica in 1755. The first democratic state in Europe was Corsica. And it was a Masonic republic. Fascinated Benjamin Franklin, interested the American insurgents, Thomas Jefferson. He was a Freemason, 1778, the Lodge of the Nine Muses. And this is the Beati Paoli, or a cult that there's these murders that just like the company related murders we talk about in America all the time. The Order of the Solar Temple, blah, 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 blah. I don't want to. Carlo Bonaparte fought with and for Pasquale de Paoli. Napoleon's father, right?
Well, yes and maybe no.
Yeah, right,
But the father who raised him and of Russia.
right, right. So he was fought with Pascal de Paoli. Young Napoleon joined the Jacobins.
Mm-hmm.
Blah 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 blah. The company cut in two by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. That spurs the Age of Exploration. So the company finances the Age of Exploration, trying to reopen the trade routes.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
these guys have crazy idea. They learned from the Arabs you could sail west because the Arabs had been to America. There just wasn't anything there at the time. So remember, Columbus was not looking for the end of the Silk Road.
That's right.
Columbus was looking for the eastern end of the Spice Road. Don't
Yes.
forget that. That included opium.
And he thought he
Which,
was going to the eastern side of India.
right. This is where he thought he was going. This is where he thought he was going. He didn't think he was going to connect to the Silk Road. He thought he was going to reconnect with the Spice Road. That's important. And he was born in the Republic of Genoa, which repossessed the island of Corsica, which is where Napoleon is going to be born.
Yep.
And his father was a mercer. Columbus's family were in the wool weaving business, the textile industry. That's how he had the business connections to get financing from the Drapers Guild banks who
Okay.
financed his trips. So there's another guy who gets financed by the same people. So this guy. So coincidentally enough, Henry Tudor becomes King of England in 1485 through a bullshit. It's total bullshit. But he is all about his money. He's actually educated. He's very well educated. He locks himself in his office and he counts his money. It's the king's taxes. He counts every nickel personally. Well, as soon as Columbus comes back from the East Indies, shooting his mouth off about the East Indies, another navigator named Giovanni Caboto, John Cabot, as in Henry Cabot Lodge, he makes a beeline for Henry Tudor's court in England and says, you should claim possession of North America, which nobody has figured out there's a North America yet. But remember, there's evidence that the Vikings had been not just in Newfoundland, but all the way down the New England coast. And that's where John Cabot sails directly for. He makes a deal with Henry Tudor, Henry the Seventh.
Mm-hmm.
And this whole venture is financed by the House of Bardee, which is the mother house of the House of Rothschild. Rothschild comes along a lot later. They are a sept clan of House Bardee.
Okay.
The Bank of Bardee, the company Bardee, who financed this voyage to the New World to claim someplace they've already been to, the company's already been to, which is New England. So this is the Drapers Company. This is their coat of arms. This is like, and remember, Jason is a Jewish name, and Jason was after the Golden Fleece,
Right.
which is not only a source of gold, but leather and furs are part of the Drapers Guild. It's all about the clothing merchants, the clothiers. That's where my ancestors come in. They were in the fur and leather trade for thousands of years.
This
That's
brings this wow, this sheds more light on something that, of course, was instrumental in my. I just came out with my the Esoteric Napoleon II, which is about the Louisiana Territory and the Lewis and Clark expedition and such. And when you
okay.
consider how many French fur trappers and traders were all over North America, what you're talking about here kind of expands on the possibilities as to who these guys were really affiliated with and working for and what they actually knew, because I imply and suggest in Esoteric Napoleon II that these were the guys who knew the real ancient secrets of North America, and they were kind of helping
Yeah.
Lewis and Clark, or Meriwether Lewis,
Oh,
along
yeah.
because he was on a
Yeah.
secret mission from Jefferson. Clark didn't know what the hell Lewis was actually looking for.
Right. George Rogers Clark was a badass bodyguard. He's a very cool guy, but you're right. It's all about Meriwether. Well, the Distinguished Order of the Golden Fleece is a Catholic order of chivalry founded in 1430 in Bruges by Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. Current knights of the Spanish Order include Emperor Akihito of Japan, former Tsar Simeon of Bulgaria. This is the reach of the company. Little clubs, it's not a strict organization, but it's a loose association of these people who are connected. And this is the Distinguished Order of the Golden Fleece to this very day. Emperor Akihito of Japan. So you have Giovanni Cabuto claimed North America for the Tudors, financed by Company Bardi. Cabot received money from Bardi family of Florence to support Cabot's expedition. They're from Florence, which is where Leonardo da Vinci was based mostly, right? Was Florence.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Finance, blah, 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 blah. Once again, Jason is a Jewish name, and they were after the Golden Fleece.
Mm-hmm.
It's not so much necessarily that I can prove that but these people think of themselves as the modern day heirs. So you get the Knights Templar who become the Freemasons, but then you get the Muscovy Company, which is the first joint stock corporation in the history of the world, and it just happens to be the northern half of the Silk Road, chartered by Elizabeth in 1555, and Sebastian Cabot, son of John Cabot, becomes one of the first members of the Muscovy, the first modern joint stock corporation in the world.
Yeah.
The only reason the Americans rebelled against the British Empire was under British law, you could not sell or trade your stocks in a company without the express written permission of the sovereign. They wanted a free Wall Street started in a coffee shop on Wall Street.
Sure. Yeah.
So the company of merchant adventurers to new lands, and then you get the British East India Company, which becomes one of the most powerful corporations in the world.
Yep.
So Elizabeth McGickian and spymaster John Dee was the son of Roland, a mercer and gentleman courtier. John Dee's father was in the textile industry and Drapers Guild. William Shakespeare's family were smugglers, were wool smugglers. They were pirates. They were wool pirates. Young William, 7 years old, 9 years old, watched his Uncle John being drawn and quartered literally in front of his eyes, in front of the whole town when they got caught.
Yikes.
Well, Christopher Marlowe.
That's some childhood trauma right there.
Christopher Marlowe was a little bit older than Shakespeare. He spied for Elizabeth.
Yeah.
He killed a man in a knife fight in a bar and was killed by a secret agent in a knife fight in a bar.
Yeah. Kit Marlowe.
So this is, and the Tudors are very interesting, and how they hijacked the British throne right before Columbus discovers America. So anyway, so you get the Jacobite kings of England, these Christian or these Catholic. Now, my Irish ancestors fought on the Jacobite side in a very complex relationship and were taken prisoner at the Battle of Bothwell Bridge in 1678, 1679, and their punishment was to be transported to America. So my Irish ancestors are Jacobites, and my Jewish ancestors have been in the company for maybe over 3,000 years. So, and William Shaw becomes Master of Works to King James VI, Scientific Masonry, the death of Edward Kelly, 1598, and Freemasonry, which is a craft guild, becomes this esoteric society founded in a lot of teaching. So between the Templars and the Rosicrucians, now you have all these forbidden esoteric books go into what becomes modern Freemasonry. So the Freemasons and the French Revolution, which is going to lead us to Napoleon, guess what? French Catholic Freemasonry aristocrats. Masonic temple at the Chateau de Montaigne, blah, 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 in Gironde. After the French Revolution, the Jesuit Augustin Barwell wrote the Freemasons had actively prepared the 1789 revolution. Blah, blah, blah. Jesuit disinfoprop, Father Augustine Barwell. Okay, he's a Jesuit. This is one of the first examples of the company framing themselves in a way that nobody will believe. He says Freemasons were behind the French Revolution. They were. But he deliberately cooks up a crazy conspiracy theory that can easily be debunked so that no one will believe that the Freemasons were behind the French Revolution. This is a pattern we see: the publicity campaign behind Son of Sam, the publicity campaign behind Manson, publicity campaign behind Satanic Panic, publicity, the fake conspiracy theories that you see going around in the media today, these right-wing conspiracy theories that are easy to debunk, but it turns out that the real purpose of that is so that no one will believe the facts about the real conspiracy theory. This goes back to that. So college work in Moravia and Bohemia. So communism, modern communism, is born among these Sephardic Jews, Unitarians living in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Austria, Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, and related Freemasons start the American Revolution, and you get your perfect Masonic Republic being established in America.
Mm-hmm.
Washington is a Freemason. They're all. George Washington. Did you go to George Washington University, or do you not want to say?
Oh no, me? I went to San Diego State.
Oh, okay. Well, George Washington
Aztecs.
University is there. Well, there you go. George Washington University is known as Spy School USA, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Alec Baldwin graduated from George Washington University. So there's that painting of Washington in his full Masonic regalia. The Mormon Church still preserves as holy relics Joseph Smith's Masonic regalia.
Oh, Mormonism is big on Masonic symbolism, as we know.
Oh yeah, when they first got to Nauvoo, they built a Masonic lodge first, then a temple.
Mm-hmm.
Joshua Bloomer, the first graduate of Columbia University, was a Freemason, and that's a big deal. That's a big deal. He provided the Bible that Washington was sworn in as president, a Masonic Bible. And then you get Freemason Andrew Jackson leads the covert invasion of Florida to destabilize the Spanish Empire there. So what about Napoleon Bonaparte in the company? Well, there's Napoleon and Freemasons. There's no evidence that Abraham Lincoln actually joined a Masonic lodge.
Same for Napoleon.
There's no evidence that Napoleon did, but his brother Joe was of 88th degree. Like was he 33? Joseph Bonaparte was admitted to Marseille's lodge, the Parfait Sincérité, Grand Master of the Grand Orient of France, and founded the Grand Lodge National of Spain.
Yes, and Masons loved Napoleon. His
yeah.
closest inner circle was full of Masons. Gaspard Monge was, his number one mentor. He was a Mason. The Masons loved him, even though he publicly was like, yes, nice. They loved the guy, and of course, he was loved in America too.
Oh, sure. Well, and I think to a great extent, Napoleon is the Charles Manson of the French Republic. He was more of the public. He's more the Jesse James. He wasn't. I think his brother Joe might have actually been the brains of the outfit.
Well, now in my work, I kind of agree with the theory that they switch places. That's a theory that's been around even from his lifetime. The British suspected that he had switched places with Joseph, and the U.S. Navy sent a frigate to receive Napoleon. Joseph begged him, switch places with me. This was at La Rochelle while the British were on their way to get him. And history tells us that they did not switch places, but the theory,
history would tell us that,
has been openly seriously considered now since the 1970s. And when you look at the evidence, in my opinion, I agree with it. I think they did switch places. I think the Joseph Bonaparte that lived in the United States after Waterloo was Napoleon, and I go into that in my book.
Wow. Because after Charlie got sent back to prison, he didn't start any more cults. He didn't even organize a gang. Yeah. So I think that kind of fits the idea that Napoleon was more of the Charles Manson than he
Well,
was.
and the negative things about him is 90% of it is British propaganda, a bunch of British
Oh,
lies.
that's true. Oh,
This
yeah.
guy's the
Oh,
most
sure.
slandered historical
Oh,
figure of the last 200 years.
I got a buddy of mine. You guys are speaking the same language. Well, that's like Huey P. Long of Louisiana was not nearly as bad as he was made out to be,
Yeah.
but he was a threat to the deep state, obviously.
Hmm.
So later life, the United States and Europe, the American Philosophical Society, blah, 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 blah. Benjamin Franklin. Um, right. We get Napoleon sold Louisiana to the United States. His younger brother, like all of the Bonapartes were Freemasons except supposedly Napoleon, right?
Right.
I think even his in-laws were Freemasons, right?
I believe some of them were, and I'm not sure about the
Yeah,
descent.
she was initiated into a women's lodge, and she was a grand master of a women's lodge. But Napoleon was not a Freemason,
Napoleon himself was not. Um,
supposedly, right? But how can we how can we really be sure?
it would have emerged, I
Okay.
think it would have emerged. And if I'm not mistaken, I talk about in my book there's evidence that he might have been um, in a particular lodge where he was honored, but there's no proof that he was. It's more of a suggestion. Uh,
Well, and voodoo is more French Freemasonry than it is African culture. It's a blending of the two, but it's got at least as much Freemasonry as it does any
well,
African.
and voodoo, also the African voodoo, was brought to the Americas by British enthusiasts of it,
Mhm.
not indirectly by virtue of the slave trade,
Right, right.
but British practitioners of magic with the K and
And French.
voodoo are the ones who brought voodoo to the Americas.
And French. There's a
And
French
oh yeah,
lodge
oh
in
gosh, yeah,
Sugar
yeah,
Island.
yeah,
But
yeah.
the funny thing is, everything people think they know about the Salem witch trials, they get from a fictional play called The Crucible,
Yeah, I
which
know.
was
Yeah.
which was sort of researched. In
Uh,
real life, Tituba was not teaching those English girls Caribbean witchcraft.
no.
They were teaching her English witchcraft.
Yeah.
But anyway, so then, so Napoleon grew up surrounded by Freemasons, and then you get Napoleon's Secretary of War, Antoine Fabre d'Olivet. He was an occultist, a Hebraist,
Uh-huh.
and the son of a silk importer.
Imagine that. A draper.
He um he translated the Neo-Pythagorean work, The Golden Verses. He was a Hebrew scholar in correspondence with Joseph Smith. He was an occultist who had a heavy influence on Eliphas Levi. He was a native speaker of Provençal and a Reformed Protestant, so he had contacts among the the latter day Cathars in France. First located Hyperborea at the North Pole. He was a hit songwriter. He was tutored on the nature of the soul by his dead fiancee, Julie Marcel, and wrote extensively on basic oneness of all major religions, Unitarianism.
Well, there's a couple in there that jump right out at me. The Hyperborea one and being tutored by the ghost of his dead fiance. But
Yeah,
those are discussions in themselves.
yeah,
Those are
right.
future shows.
Right. So he was born in the Languedoc. So the Hebraic tongue restored and the true meaning of the Hebrew words. A heavy correspondence with Joseph Smith. His father, a businessman in the international silk industry. Okay, so what? Well, there's this guy named Abraham Zapruder who took this film of the Kennedy assassination, which everybody thinks proves there was a second gunman, which is the fake conspiracy theory that they want they want everybody to pay attention to because it's easy to debunk. But what you need to know tonight about Abraham Zapruder was he was in the textile industry. He owned a dress factory.
Okay.
Found work as a clothing pattern maker in the Manhattan's garment district, including making clothes, I think, for learners. I think he made clothes for learners shops. He was a 33rd degree Freemason and Inspector General of the Scottish Rite, born in Ukraine. A Ukrainian, one more Ukrainian Jew who turns up in this, a 33rd degree Freemason. And the funny thing is, he worked with the wife of George de Mohrenschildt. Do you know?
Oh,
Do you know who I'm talking about?
oh
Oh
yes, of
yeah.
course. Oh,
They
this
owned,
really this drags the JFK assassination milieu right into this discussion of the company and
and Napoleon,
and Napoleon and
because New Orleans is where all
yeah,
the first the royalist refugees all turn up in, because, for example, the tradition of giving chocolates to your sweetie is because Napoleon would give chocolates to Josephine, right? That's very specific. His official chocolatier was named Bissinger, who had to flee France and who shows up in New Orleans and makes his way up the river to St. Louis. And Bissinger's chocolate is still a family business in St. Louis, and they make the fabulous chocolates. There are so many Bonapartists, there are so many Huguenots, there are so many conspiracies that
yep,
came up the Mississippi and Wabash River valleys where I grew up.
yep.
I'm steeped in this stuff. Okay, so his Jennifer Jr.'s offices were on the fourth floor of the Dowtex building across the street from the Texas school, but he wasn't standing in front of his own office building. If he'd been standing in front of his own office building when he filmed the execution of Kennedy, he could have turned his camera upwards and he could have seen Oswald. But he went across the street for some reason where he
Hmm.
couldn't see Oswald in the window. That's an amazing, but that's not the most amazing coincidence. The most amazing coincidence, the person nobody ever talks about, is Oswald's mother, Marguerite, who was Quebecois. She came from a Quebecois family. She came from a Cajun family. And see, you have this, the Underground Railroad
Yeah, I've
was,
never heard that. You're right. That doesn't get talked about. What the hell? Go ahead.
well, the Underground Railroad was not invented by people trying to rescue slaves. It was used by people trying to free rescued slaves. And the Bushes were real big in the Underground Railroad. So you have this, I grew up, moonshiners and all kinds of people. This smuggling network still existed all along all the rivers where I grew up. And Oswald's mother, Marguerite, she's Cajun, she's Quebecois. And Oswald's father died before he was born, supposedly died of a heart attack. You know how easy it is to make cyanide poisoning look like a heart attack?
Sure. Yeah.
2 months later, second son was born, Lee Harvey. January of 44, she withdrew Lee from the children's home, moved with him to Dallas. The same time that, this is not too long after, this is right around the time that Zapruder moves to Dallas. Then at some point, she takes him to the Bronx. Son of Sam, son of Sam, son of Sam. And she works at Lerner dress shops, where Abraham Zapruder and his family probably made clothes for the Lerner dress shops. Well, Gaston Bullock Means, do you know who he is?
Bullocks, the
Gaston
department
Bullock
store family.
Means, no. He's a lawyer from the South. He's a character on Boardwalk Empires based on a real guy named Gaston Bullock Means.
Okay.
He's the guy who wrote the book saying that from Ohio, President Harding was assassinated by his wife and her lesbian
Okay.
lover. He wrote that book, The Strange Death of Warren G. Harding.
Wow. Okay.
He was one of the original secret agents when J. Edgar Hoover graduated from law school and went to work at the Department of Justice. One of the secret agents he handled was Gaston Bullock Means.
Interesting.
Gaston Bullock Means is tied up like this in the phony Lindbergh baby kidnapping.
Uh-huh.
He was con artist extraordinaire. His close friend Whitaker was chess buddies with Crowley.
Oh boy. Okay.
So Gaston Bullock Means's family were major. Several years he was with the Cannon Mill offices in New York. He came from a Southern family that was in textiles, and his father was a lawyer. Gaston Bullock Means is a member of the Drapers Guild, the Drapers Company.
So
Great nephew of Confederate General Behringer. He was special agent under William J. Burns. He
so
went to
a
work as
BI special agent under Burns.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Implicated Warren Harding and Andrew Mellon of conspiracy and bribery. Started a private detective agency for Cannon Mills because his family owned, they were in cotton and textiles in the South. Okay, so a lot of this has to do with, okay. So then there's this woman named Ruth Baker Pratt who was very close friends and raised a lot of money for Bill Donovan. Bill Donovan was, between the wars, Bill Donovan was a Wall Street lawyer doing
Yeah.
business with Bill Casey, setting up money
Yeah.
laundering schemes with British banks in the
Sure.
Bahamas,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And Bill Donovan, Ruth Baker Pratt's family owned a textile mill in Massachusetts. And I think they owned one of the mills where Jack Kerouac's family and Bobby Beausoleil's family worked. I think the Pratts
Okay.
owned the mill where they worked. They were all Quebecois garment workers union people.
Now,
Berkowitz is
do they have a connection to the American South? Because a lot of Acajuns, a lot of that, of course, we know the Cajun diaspora, the Acadian diaspora. That's how we get the Cajuns down to the Gulf and
right, right.
Mobile and all of that.
And they go to work in the textile mills in the Northeast, and they're between the Jews and the Quebecois, they pretty much dominate the garment workers union in the
Okay.
Northeast.
Okay.
And yeah, she's from the Baker family, born Ruth Sears Baker, as in the Bakers in the Bush administration. She comes from
Wow.
that family. I think they are old money people.
Okay.
Well,
So I have a question here then.
okay.
Uh, wow. This question comes up. We're told that back during his first term, Trump mentioned privately to Judge Napolitano that releasing the JFK file would ruin everything. And now we're seeing shenanigans with its release again. And I'm wondering, the idea of the company and its hands. I wonder if that has something to do with everything that will be ruined, because you're mentioning the Bushes and the Bakers, and of course, the Bush political dynasty, and HW was long suspected of being involved with the JFK assassination. I mean, I'm wondering how much of this company history, might be connected to the assassination, particularly if it was a coup, which I think it was.
Well, to make a long story short, I think I can prove that JFK was assassinated. This was a KGB operation, and they did a very good job of framing the right wing of the CIA for doing it, and they just caught everybody off guard. That's why the CIA participated in the conspiracy to frame themselves for assassinating JFK, because it was, and we're talking about Angleton, Lansdale, and a whole bunch of other people arranged for Oswald to shoot Kennedy, and then they frame the right wing for doing it. But that's a whole other episode.
Yes.
I'm almost to the end of my presentation.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Now remember, Berkowitz was adopted by Nate and Nan Berkowitz, and they worked in the garment industry, and they were also, I think they both worked in the garment union. The
Mhm.
garment workers, that same union owned the factory where Rosemary LaBianca bought her dresses that she never paid for and was selling in her boutique in Los Feliz, and was not paying for those dresses. So that's how connected all this stuff is.
Wow.
Yeah, and Son of Sam. So Son of Sam victim Christine Freund, her family are from Austria.
Mm-hmm.
And Stacy Moskowitz's family worked in the garment industry. She worked in the shoe importing company. Well, when Christine got shot, her supposed fiance, John Deal, in the car, not a scratch on. Well, I think he might have been injured. Anyway, the very first newspaper article, I think this is the Daily News, with her friend John Deal, age 30, a knitting mill executive. He worked in the garment industry. He was not just a bartender. He worked in the garment industry as an executive, junior executive. And after that, they changed the story, and he's no longer works in a knitting mill. He's a bartender. What's the big secret? She worked at Reynolds Securities, which was the Reynolds tobacco family, and then they get into metals, and it's Reynolds Mining, Reynolds Aluminum, Reynolds Metals,
Yeah.
and Reynolds Tobacco, and Reynolds Securities in New York City. Christine Freund was an executive secretary at Reynolds Securities, doing business every single day on the phone with the secretary, and would have known by face and by name. Carl Denaro's stepfather and cousin would have known her by face and by name because they dealt with her boss every single day.
Wow.
They handled a lot of funds, investing and washing money for Reynolds. And Reynolds Metals is the company that co-sponsored that internal coup against the Liberal government of Australia and New Zealand that put all those excise taxes on those Reynolds mines, and all that money was, and a lot of that, and that's the Nugan Bank is tied up in that. That's all 1974. The Nugan Bank is also tangled up in that soft coup against the Australian government. And she works for them. She may have known all about, because she is murdered. She's murdered on the weekend, and on Monday morning the coup is launched. It's not a military coup. It's a political coup to overthrow the parliamentary government of Australia and New Zealand. And
Mm.
that happens like 48 hours after she's shot. And
Wow.
she
Wow.
worked, and she would have known a lot of what was going on. A lot of what was going on. Yeah, David P. Reynolds is one of these that comes up because he was her boss and they were directly involved in that. Well, I only mention it because the Reynolds Aluminum Company invented the whole Keep America Beautiful campaign, and
Yeah.
they invented an award, the Keep America Beautiful award, that they gave to themselves. And one of the companies that they first made a deal with was PepsiCo. PepsiCo, in the movie, not the movie JFK, in the movie Nixon, Nixon was meeting with oil company executives in Dallas the day Kennedy got shot. That's not true. Nixon was meeting with PepsiCo executives the day that Kennedy got shot
Okay.
in Dallas.
Hmm.
And I think that's it.
Wow.
That's the
Wow.
briefest summary and give you some idea of the company.
That basically what this is the first episode of many I want to have with you.
Yeah, and
'Cause
I've been
there's
doing this for 5 years, and I've just
wow.
started scratching the surface. I get a lot of help. I'm the
Yeah.
clearinghouse for people who've done research, and
Huh.
you've been a huge help. I will send you. I promised you some documents. I'm going to send
Okay.
you. We're spending one episode at a time on the stuff you sent me. Did you send that stuff to me? No, somebody else sent me. You know who Charles Bohannon was?
Not off the top of my head.
Well, Charles Bohannon wrote the book for American counterinsurgency between World War II and 9/11. After 9/11, the United States adopted the old SS counterinsurgency manual, translated into
Yeah.
English. They've been using ever since.
That
But
doesn't surprise me.
before then, it was Charles Bohannon wrote the book. And he had this deep experience with the Huck Rebellion. And before that, he was China, Burma, India in World War II.
Hmm.
And his boss was Edward Lansdale.
Okay.
Well, some correspondence, all of his files are declassified, and there's Stanford has them or somebody has them, and somebody's scanning them and sending them to us. So we get this. Lansdale is retired. Bohannon is still working in the Philippines officially. These are personal letters, and he kept carbon copies of personal letters. He's going to send them back to Lansdale, where they are conspiring to deceive Inspector General investigators of the CIA over packages that Lansdale is sending to. We're noticing all this steganography. We're noticing you got to read between the lines.
Sure.
So there's all this correspondence that came out, and of course, the company was heavily involved in the opium trade
Mhm.
and the whale oil trade and the spice trade going back, and the
Sure.
soap trade going back to Nantucket and all of those companies.
Yeah.
And the Stanfords, the Folgers, that's where they all get their money from. And then the money from the opium trade is where you start Citibank. The National City Bank of Manhattan is founded on drug money. The Chase Manhattan Bank is founded on opium money. And, sugar is a drug, rum is a drug, and the slave trade. The Perkinses, this is how they make all their money to start all these banks that kickstart the Industrial Revolution.
Wow.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Mhm.
Um, What okay, I was listening to this whole thing. The one thing I wanted to know that's pretty relevant to what's going on right now is Epstein's connection to the company.
To make a long story short, Bill Casey, who would become Ronald Reagan's campaign manager and Ronald Reagan's director of the CIA in the 1930s, he went to all these people, including Lindbergh and FDR's administration, all these taxes. He said, "Don't worry about it. I know some banks, British owned banks in the Caribbean, where we can set up tax shelters." He invents the tax shelter. Bill Casey did all the way back in the 30s. Then he goes to work for OSS in Europe. He's working with Philip J. Corso, who wrote the book The Day After Roswell. Well, um, what was your question?
Epstein's connection to the
Epstein.
company.
So Bill Casey he's still working on Wall Street in the 70s. And this is before the first American banks set up their own independent money laundering banks. So this young, brilliant mathematician joins the business, and his name is Jeffrey Epstein. And he eventually starts his own company in 1981. So Epstein is the private banker who takes over those operations from Bill Casey when Bill Casey becomes busy as Ronald Reagan's campaign manager and Ronald Reagan's director of the CIA. Jeffrey Epstein took Bill Casey's place in that business that's going on of laundering money and finding tax shelters and doing these complex financial calculations in his head. Epstein directly replaces Bill Casey, who
Huh.
Bill Casey operated the sock puppet named Ronald Reagan.
I see. I see.
That's
That was Bill Casey. And oh my God. So Iran Contra, BCCI,
yeah.
Oliver North told the story about how Director Casey is the one who instructed him to set up BCCI with that Arab guy and to do that. But during that testimony, um, um, Oliver North always made it sound like that was the first time Oliver North had ever been involved in a thing like that. There's that picture of Oliver North with Nugan, with Hand, with Edward Lands. Edward, I think it's Lansdale, and they're the board of directors of the Nugan Hand Bank all the way back in 1969, 1970.
Oh,
So Oliver, this has been going on, and they've been doing this forever. During the American Revolution, speaking of French Caribbean, during the American Revolution, five members of the British cabinet were secretly selling weapons and other war supplies to the American patriots through the black market in the Caribbean
wow.
because they supported the American Revolution and to profit off of it, but to start because remember, the pamphleteer, the famous Tom Paine. Remember, he came from Britain, and then he went back to Britain and almost got the revolution going in Britain. It almost happened in Britain before France.
Now,
And all of these people are directly connected to the company.
wow. This is all astonishing. We're going to have to stop right here. And I definitely want to have you back on soon